Alan Garcia Perez became president of Peru in 1985 after winning the election in a landslide that seemed less like a democratic process and more like the culmination of an inevitable destiny. He reached 45.7% of the votes in the first round, eclipsing any opposition. Alfonso Barrantes, his closest contender, got only 21.2%. And faced with the prospect of a defeat that promised to be even more overwhelming in the second round, he decided to withdraw from it, saving the country from an obviously unnecessary social and economic strain. The United Left shook hands with the Peruvian Aprista Party and stepped aside. Thus, that 36-year-old man, standing 1.93 meters tall, rose to power as the youngest democratically elected president in Latin American history up to that point. At times, he looked too young to bear on his shoulders the weight of a battered, exhausted, and deeply wounded nation. However, his mere presence seemed to contradict any doubts. Alan projected a defiant, almost insolent confidence, the vibrant conviction of someone who feels called by history, chosen by a higher power to carry the tablets of truth under his arm. And when he spoke, the entire country seemed to stop, to hold its breath, to listen to him and hang on that enveloping voice, those phrases that seemed to be carefully sculpted before being cast to the wind. He possessed a gift that transcended mere eloquence. He didn't just communicate ideas, but clothed them with an almost musical cadence. Every pause, every gesture, every inflection, every rise in his tone of voice was calculated with the precision of an artist who knows the soul of his audience and knows exactly how and where to touch it. He had an exceptional talent for it, and before him, an audience that needed to believe him, an audience willing to be seduced by the illusion that history could still change its course, that destiny was not written, and things could still change. His words fell upon the country like long-awaited rain after a long drought, and for a moment, that moment that sometimes precedes great tragedies, everything seemed possible. However, that illusion would soon fade away in the most bitter way, giving way to despair. In the next few minutes, we will unravel the threads of that collapse. If you like horror stories, I invite you to stay until the end. Also, give this video a like and subscribe if you haven't done so yet. Let's start from the beginning. To understand the first government of Alan Garcia, it's necessary to understand the situation in Peru at the time he rose to power. Fernando Belaúnde's second government was a democratic transition. Which, although it restored institutional order to the country after 12 long years of military dictatorship, failed spectacularly in its attempts to stabilize the economy and contain the advance of terrorism. Belaúnde received a fiscal structure in crisis, marked by deficits dating back to 1972, which forced the state to maintain a level of spending far above its real capabilities. To cover that imbalance, the country resorted to massive loans that ended up ballooning the foreign debt. Between 1981 and 1983, the situation worsened drastically due to the convergence of three decisive events. The first was the drop in international prices of metals such as silver, copper, and lead, whose exports then formed the backbone of the Peruvian economy. The second was the increase in external debt interest rates due to the phenomenon known as the Volcker shock, a measure that financially strangled many countries in the region. Finally, nature delivered the coup de grace. The 1983 El Niño phenomenon destroyed the country's agricultural and road infrastructure, causing an abrupt drop in GDP and a food shortage that began to be felt, as if that weren't enough. Terrorist organizations like Shining Path and the MRTA, which we've already discussed in depth on this channel, found in that chaos the ideal scenario to expand. At that time, the state failed to grasp the magnitude of the threat and underestimated it, making the problem even worse. The frustration in the years leading up to Alan Garcia's rise was palpable. It is estimated that between 1980 and the first quarter of 1985, more than 4,400 strikes took place, affecting around 3.5 million workers. Inflation soared to 160%, and the country entered a recession. Many believed then that the economy had hit rock bottom, without suspecting that it was just on the edge of the precipice. The real free fall was about to begin. On July 28, 1985, during his first address to the nation before the Congress of the Republic, Allen announced a measure that was actually an ethical challenge to the global order and that would begin to delay destiny. He proclaimed the famous 10% rule, declaring that Peru would not allocate more than 10% of the total value of its exports to the payment of foreign debt. The agreed figure was 60. This measure meant freeing up an extra $50 for every 100 generated by exports, injecting the state with immediate liquidity that he promised to redirect toward economic recovery. The speech was incendiary and seductive. It appealed both to popular indignation and to national pride. From now on, Peru's main creditor is its own people. We will not pay for the demands and abuses of imperialism with the hunger of the poorest. For a moment, the decision was perceived by large segments of society as a great act of courage, a historic vindication of the founding mystique of Victor Raúl Haya de la Torre. For some, it was a heroic gesture of sovereignty. For others, a financial suicide. Time would prove that it was the latter. Peru's debt was around $14 billion, and it didn't have a single face. The creditor landscape was complex. On one hand, there were organizations like the IMF and the World Bank who also set the rules of the game. On the other hand, there was the Paris Club, where powers like Japan, the United States, France, and Germany awaited the return of their capital. But the largest creditor bloc was made up of international banks. As expected, the challenge posed by Alan Garcia triggered a complete isolation from the global financial system. The IMF ended up declaring Peru an ineligible country, a ruling that cut off access to any line of credit. In an interconnected world, Peru lost its most valuable asset, credibility, international trust, that invisible capital on which markets depend. The problem was not only the impossibility of obtaining new loans. Foreign investment interest evaporated, and it made sense. How could anyone trust the word of the Peruvian state? How could anyone assume it would honor its commitments? It was impossible to bet on a country that gave up the predictability of its rules. So, not only did capital stop coming in, it started to leave, systematically fleeing to more stable destinations, turning the outflow of foreign exchange into a real financial hemorrhage. Silent but relentless. With fewer dollars circulating in the system, the country's ability to import essential products was quickly eroded, like food, medicine, and even industrial supplies, all indispensable for sustaining production. On top of this, foreign suppliers also withdrew their trust. They stopped accepting letters of credit and demanded advance payments in dollars and in cash. Each transaction became more difficult, more expensive, and in many cases simply unfeasible. The result was a progressive suffocation of imports, and with that, a direct blow to local production. Factories began to feel the lack of supplies, markets felt the absence of basic products, and shortages began to seep into the daily lives of Peruvians. And just as the most relentless logic of economics dictates, when goods become scarce, prices start to rise. However, the symptoms of collapse did not appear immediately. Allen had a plan, and he was deeply convinced that it would work. Along with the 10% rule, his government implemented a set of measures that history would end up remembering as the Heterodox Plan, an emergency program designed to trigger a massive consumption boom. According to his logic, the Peruvian economy was stagnant due to a lack of internal demand. Consumption was very low, and that's why many of the factories were operating at only half of their productive capacity. But what if people had more liquidity and therefore greater purchasing power. Surely consumption would increase, demand would grow, forcing industries to maximize their production and make better use of their fixed costs, thus reducing the cost per unit. This phenomenon would absorb inflationary pressures, stabilizing prices almost naturally. Convinced that he had found a formula, he set the mechanism in motion through 4 fundamental steps. The first was the freezing of prices. The state intervened directly in the market, setting the prices of essential products in the basket of basic necessities: milk, rice, bread, sugar, and other daily food items. The official price lists were published in the newspapers, and they had to remain visible, posted on the walls of every store in the country. The measure was not limited to food. Public services such as water, electricity, and telephone were also frozen. The same applied to rents. No property owner could raise the rent of their residential properties or commercial premises. Of course, this scenario of low prices was not sustainable on its own. Behind every bag of rice and every liter of milk, there was the invisible hand of the state covering the difference through a massive subsidy system. The mechanism was as simple in appearance as it was deeply dangerous in its consequences. For example, if the real cost of a unit of bread was 8 NT, the government set its price at 5 and covered the remaining 3 itself, allowing the citizen to enjoy an artificially low price. But where did the money come from to finance this display of state generosity? The funds came mainly from 2 sources: from the capital retained by the decision not to pay the foreign debt, and from the central bank's international reserves, in other words, from the state's coffers. That injection of resources created an atmosphere of prosperity and a sense of stability, a collective relief that was as pleasant as it was momentary. The second major measure was the increase in salaries. By decree, the government ordered a general raise in wages, whose deepest impact was felt in the minimum wage. It was raised by a striking 50%. The adjustment also reached teachers and the public sector. This was undoubtedly the measure that sparked the greatest social enthusiasm. For the first time in years, thousands of families experienced the relief of feeling that their salary was enough to make it to the end of the month, just as the plan had intended. Consumption soared along with the new income, generating a true wealth effect that created a collective sense of optimism among the people. For a moment, the country thought it saw a light at the end of the tunnel. The third major measure was the consolidation of the MUC dollar. Although it was not created during his administration, Alan Garcia's government made it the centerpiece of the strategy. Under this system, the state set an official exchange rate much lower than the real value of the dollar in the market. It was essentially an extension of the same logic that supported subsidies, to intervene directly to artificially keep the price of an essential input low. But in this case, the government bought dollars at the real market price and then sold them at a lower rate to certain business sectors, covering the difference. The objective was clear: to allow Peruvian companies to import food, medicine, machinery, and supplies using a cheap dollar. This way, production costs wouldn't go up and domestic prices wouldn't have to skyrocket either. The MUC dollar was also used to negotiate with the country's major business groups, especially with that elite dubbed by the press as the 12 Apostles. Among them were powerful groups like Romero, Brescia, and Ferreros, Nicolini, Raffo, Weiss, among others. The logic was pragmatic. The government guaranteed them preferential access to this subsidized dollar and favorable tax conditions in exchange for ensuring production, supply, and employment. However, it didn't take long before the system started to become distorted. The gap between the MUC dollar and the real value of the dollar became so huge that it ended up leading to a perverse distortion. What had been conceived as an instrument of stability, it turned into an extraordinarily lucrative business. Many companies began to request large amounts of subsidized foreign currency for supposed imports of strategic goods. But in practice, a good part of those dollars ended up being resold on the black market, generating immense fortunes without having to, producing absolutely nothing. The outcome would be devastating. As you can imagine, the MUC dollar business also paved the way for a vast network of corruption. It didn't take long for the companies that benefited most to not be the most efficient ones, but rather those willing to offer the largest bribes. Without a doubt, the MUC dollar was one of the mechanisms that contributed the most to the draining of the national reserves. Every dollar that the central bank handed out at a politically set price meant a direct loss for the country's coffers, a wound that deepened as the gap between the fictitious price and the real market price became more and more abysmal. However, on the surface, none of this was noticeable. The illusion remained intact for a while. The fourth measure of the Heterodox plan was the drastic reduction of interest rates, perhaps one of the most enticing and at the same time dangerous decisions of the program. According to Garcia's logic, if the cost of money was low, companies would turn to borrowing en masse to modernize their machinery and expand their operations. More investment should translate into higher production and more jobs. So to force this scenario, the government set interest rates below inflation levels. In practice, this meant that if the real annual inflation was 100% and the bank only charged you a rate of 60, the value of your debt would decrease month by month. The money owed tomorrow would be worth much less than the capital received today. Essentially, the system rewarded taking on debt. You made money simply by borrowing it. But while big businessmen and those who had access to this mechanism watched as their debts evaporated under the advance of inflation, the other side of the coin revealed a silent tragedy, that of the savers. Families who for years had deposited the accumulated effort of a lifetime in the banking system watched helplessly as their wealth vanished day by day under the weight of a currency that was beginning to lose its meaning. Saving stopped being a virtue and became an omen of doom, a financial self-destruction. No one wanted to keep their intis in the bank. Then the inevitable happened. Capital began a desperate flight, seeking refuge in dollars or tangible assets, accelerating a currency outflow that ultimately bled the system dry. However, once again, this did not become apparent immediately. Between mid-1985 and the end of 1986, the model projected an appearance of unquestionable solidity. Prices remained stable, and for the first time in many years, people felt that their income was good for more than just mere subsistence. Daily effort made sense again. That period was the springtime for Alan Garcia's Peru. It was the era of full restaurants, of appliance stores running out of televisions, refrigerators, and sound systems. It was the time when many families regained the luxury of small pleasures, of postponed aspirations. From the outside, the numbers were dazzling. Inflation was receding while the GDP, driven by the engine of mass consumption, grew by a solid 10% in the second year of government, positioning itself as the highest growth rate in the entire region. Everything seemed to indicate that Peru had finally found the formula. That young president had not only ignited hope, but was also keeping alive a flame that illuminated the lives of all Peruvians. However, the feeling of immediate progress and the optimism of having money in their pockets were blinding much of the population to what was happening at the same time. Terrorism had entered a phase of national expansion. Shining Path decided that their so-called People's War had to reach the cities in order to strangle the state from the cities. And Lima, which until then had felt relatively safe, began to experience massive blackouts, targeted assassinations, kidnappings, and the chilling sound of car bombs. It was then that the capital began to realize that this prosperity was advancing over a minefield. At the beginning of his term, Alan had stated that it was not necessary to fight barbarism with barbarism. Under that premise, Allen proposed an anti-terrorism strategy within the framework of the law and respect for human rights. He even promoted the Press Commission, the intention of opening spaces for dialogue and seeking a political solution to the conflict. However, the increasingly evident failure of that idealism ended up snuffing out the government's conciliatory and humanist image. The absolute breaking point came on June 18, 1986, which began as simultaneous riots in the prisons. El Frontón, Lurigancho, and Santa Barbara ended up resulting in an extrajudicial execution that history now remembers as one of the largest massacres perpetrated by the state. More than 200 inmates accused of terrorism were killed in gruesome fashion in one of the darkest and most controversial episodes of that decade. Without a doubt, this requires its own detailed analysis. To avoid straying from the main focus of this story, I will cover this episode in a separate video, available only to members of this channel. If you want to delve deeper into the massacre at El Frontón, Lurigancho, and Santa Barbara, as well as many other untold stories that I can't include in the official videos due to time and length constraints, I invite you to join this community for just 8 souls. There are already almost 500 people who contribute in this way to support this project. If you want to join, I'm also leaving a QR code here so you can do it. I would be extremely grateful. Although today many condemn the prison massacre as a serious violation of human rights, the social reality in 1986 was different. Peru at that time did not receive the news with the same outrage with which it is remembered today. In a society suffocated by the growing fear of terrorism, a hardline approach was celebrated by a large sector. This allowed Alan Garcia's popularity not only to remain steady, but to reach extraordinary levels, nearing a historic 78% approval rating, a figure rarely seen in the region. With that support, the Peruvian Aprista Party swept the municipal elections that year, winning the majority of departments, including Lima, led by Jorge del Castillo, who defeated Alfonso Barrantes, who was seeking re-election but once again failed to contain the Aprista wave. Everything seemed to be going well for the party and for the country, but it was nothing more than a mirage, a facade that hid the cracks in a financial system on the verge of collapse. The bubble had grown so much and reached such magnitude that its explosion would reach every corner of the country. The clash with reality began to manifest itself during the first months of 1987. The illusion of growing without inflation through price controls, subsidies, wage increases, and stimulating demand ran up against the limits of productive capacity. When industries reached their limit, the extra money in people's pockets stopped being a sign of prosperity and became a structural problem. Supply could no longer meet demand. Then prices began to rise and state control over them became unsustainable. The Central Reserve Bank no longer had enough resources to maintain so many subsidies, nor to keep the MUC dollar, a key element for imports. And as we saw a moment ago, the country had lost its access to international credit. Peru had fallen into its own trap. It ran out of money. Inflation, which had been contained until then, started to look like a giant wave about to sweep everything away. In a desperate attempt to postpone the collapse, Allen made a decision that would turn the crisis into a true historical tragedy. He started the printing press without restraint. The printing press is the popular term used to refer to unbacked money creation. That is, the massive printing of bills without backing from foreign currency, and, above all, without real and growing production of goods and services. At that time, the Central Reserve Bank of Peru did not have the institutional autonomy or the constitutional safeguards it has today, much less a president like Julio Velarde. So Allen took control of monetary policy, just as he had been doing since the beginning of his administration. But this time, he ordered the explosive issuance of banknotes, believing that the problem could be solved simply by printing more money. The logic seemed simple. Why not? If those new bills in your hand were worth as much as any other in circulation, why not just print more? The first thing to understand is that printing money is not always negative in itself. Many countries resort to it under certain circumstances. In fact, Allen had been doing it since the beginning of his term. The crucial difference lies in the volume and the backing. If a government prints more money without the country producing more goods and services, what it creates is an excess of bills chasing the same amount of products. And when that happens, prices are inevitably going to rise. Now imagine how serious the problem is if industrial production is plummeting. It's important to remember that money, in essence, is an interchangeable good. If its quantity increases, but what can be bought with it doesn't increase, each bill loses value. Alan Garcia ignored this basic logic of economics and ended up triggering a vicious cycle. The government printed more bills to pay subsidies and salaries, but that excess money drove up prices. The population then lost purchasing power, and to contain that discontent, the government would turn on the printing press again, print even more money, and raise salaries. As a result, prices would rise again, and the cycle would start all over. Inflation had started and was moving forward with the pedal to the metal. As the state coffers were emptied, the government was forced to increasingly restrict access to the MUC dollar. As a result, business groups were exposed to the expensive dollar of the parallel market, which drove up production costs and ended up fueling the inflationary spiral even more. The relationship between the state and businesses began to break down, and accusations of corruption surged. Many business owners felt that only those close to the regime had access to the foreign currency needed to operate. The discontent quickly spread throughout the business community. What had once been a strategic alliance began to turn into open opposition, and with that came a critical decision: the gradual withdrawal of capital from the country. Alan Garcia felt cornered, betrayed. For years, he had granted the owners of the big companies very cheap dollars, subsidies, and an artificially high domestic demand. In return, he expected them to reinvest their profits in Peru and sustain its growth. Maybe it was an extremely naive gamble, but he felt that they had played him dirty. So in a desperate act, he wanted to regain control of the game with a measure that would mark a turning point, a true point of no return. On July 28, 1987, in his Independence Day address to the nation, he surprised the country and even his own cabinet with the announcement of the nationalization of private banks, financial institutions, and insurance companies. From that moment on, the financial system would come under the control of the state. Under the rhetoric of democratizing credit, Allen proposed to take control of money away from a few economic elites in order to supposedly redirect it towards small producers, and to the provinces, promoting a more equitable national development. But behind that narrative of social justice, there was a much deeper political strategy taking shape. By nationalizing the banking system, the state acquired the ability to control the flow of credit, supervise business accounts, and directly influence their liquidity. It was, in essence, a mechanism of institutionalized financial blackmail, a measure that allowed it to reward or punish, depending on each company's alignment with the government. And at the same time, it needed to find a clear culprit for the crisis that was beginning to become evident, a scapegoat to blame. And the banks became the perfect target. He accused them of being speculators and of facilitating the outflow of dollars that the government itself had given them. After that announcement, the bridges were blown up. In fact, it was a real declaration of war by the government against the business sector and private banking. The consequences would be immediate and devastating. Investment came to a sudden halt. Domestic and foreign investors put their projects on hold out of fear of new expropriations. Obviously, no one invests in a country where the state can, at any moment, decide that your property belongs to them. The flow of capital not only came to a halt, but an alarming flight of capital abroad began. The panic was not limited to management offices. It quickly spread through the streets. In just 48 hours, savers withdrew the equivalent of more than $5 million from the banks. The average citizen, terrified at the possibility that the government would take control of their savings, rushed to the teller windows. And with those NTs in hand, they turned to the black market to buy dollars at any price. That frantic demand ended up destroying the value of the national currency, feeding the shortage of foreign currency and pushing the prices of basic goods to increasingly unreachable levels. In that context of social fracture, the writer Mario Vargas Llosa burst onto the political scene. What began as a protest manifesto alongside figures like Hernando de Soto ended up crystallizing into the Libertad movement, a civil force that would soon become a headache for the government and that would later propel him toward a presidential run. On August 21, 1987, Vargas Llosa led a historic mobilization. Plaza San Martin overflowed with more than 80,000 people raising their voices against nationalization. The people had awakened, but the nightmare was just beginning. The nationalization of the banks was political suicide for Alan Garcia. In his eagerness to take control of the flow of money, to rescue an economic model that was already obsolete, he ended up blowing up the most valuable asset of any nation: trust, legal certainty. The most ironic thing is that the nationalization was never fully carried out. In October of that same year, the government sent the police to take over the bank headquarters. In the case of the Banco de Crédito, it was necessary to use tanks to break down the doors and install the administrators appointed by the executive. However, the response was immediate: an unprecedented civil resistance. Bankers barricaded themselves in their offices, and a flood of amparo actions ended up stopping the measure in the courts. But the damage was already done. The result was an administrative anarchy without precedent. In practice, there were two boards of directors in the banks: the legal one and the one appointed by the government. That duality kept the financial system in a limbo that paralyzed its operations for months. If 1987 was the year of political rupture, 1988 would be the year of economic apocalypse. International reserves plummeted, even reaching negative levels. The Central Reserve Bank finally did not have a single dollar left to import wheat, meat, or medicine. In a new desperate attempt to contain the crisis, the then Minister of Economy, Abel Salinas, announced Plan Cero, a series of emergency measures that the people would horrifically nickname the Mega Paquetazo. It was the surrender of the model, the public acknowledgement that the country was bankrupt. Without resources to maintain the subsidies, prices could no longer remain frozen. The time had come to make them reflect reality. What came next was like surgery without anesthesia. Overnight, the price of gasoline increased by 300%, food prices tripled, the MUC dollar rose by 400%, making imports of industrial inputs more expensive by the same proportion. A salary increase was announced, but it was useless. It was eaten up by inflation within hours. Money began to lose its value rapidly. During the first months of 1988, inflation was already rising at an alarming rate, with monthly averages close to 20%. But after Plan Zero, the figure jumped to 114% in a single month, one of the highest peaks recorded in contemporary economic history. From that moment on, prices stopped being stable. They started to double, changing several times in a single day. If you went to a store in the morning to buy shoes, by the evening they didn't cost the same anymore. And that happened with all products. Then panic buying began. Anticipating an inflation that seemed to have no ceiling, families turned their homes into small warehouses. They bought sacks of rice, packs of toilet paper, boxes of oil, whatever was necessary to last for months. And in that attempt to protect themselves, they ended up completely emptying the market. But they weren't the only ones. The owners of grocery stores and supermarkets operated according to the same logic. Knowing that the merchandise would be worth more the next day, they held back the products, hiding them while waiting for new price increases. Selling today meant losing money, making money tomorrow. The result was devastating. Not only did inflation accelerate even more, but a widespread shortage also began to set in. The shelves were left empty, and thus an even crueler cycle began, one that would shape two of the saddest images of that decade: The first was lines of people. People lined up before dawn. Some even slept outside the supermarkets, hoping to get at least a kilo of rice or a liter of milk before everything ran out. Peruvians ended up spending between 4 and 8 hours a day just trying to get basic necessities. Many families organized themselves in shifts. While some stood in line, others worked or rested to come back the next day. And one of the most frustrating feelings was seeing products run out right before you reach the counter after hours of waiting. The second thing was the black market. With the formal distribution channel failing, the informal market took over. Hoarders and speculators appeared, individuals who, through informal networks, managed to get scarce products and then resell them on the streets at prices much higher than the already inflated official market prices. In that scenario, those hardest hit by poverty began to develop survival strategies. One of the most popular was the community kitchens, which emerged as a collective response to fight hunger. Families contributed the little they had, sometimes just a couple of potatoes or a handful of rice to cook a shared meal. In nutritional terms, the impact was severe. Animal protein disappeared from millions of dinner tables. That situation would get even worse on November 22, 1988, with the arrival of the so-called Black Tuesday. The government implemented a new package of measures that included an additional 100% increase in the price of gasoline, as well as massive hikes in public services. These measures were presented as necessary to curb the use of foreign currency. But in practice, the consequence was the paralysis of industrial production, the closure of factories, and massive layoffs. The government couldn't even afford to pay the ministry's electricity bills. To try to raise more revenue, the package included new taxes, 4% on exports, and the excise tax on tobacco, alcohol, and luxury goods was increased. Luxury goods weren't brand-name cars or yachts, but washing machines, microwaves, refrigerators, televisions, sound systems, makeup, things you could only buy if you had a lot of money. From a technical point of view, the decisions made in 1988 were marked by a deep contradiction. On one hand, the government was implementing orthodox adjustment measures, but at the same time it maintained a heterodox policy of printing money to cover the state's current expenses, an inconsistency that made any attempt at stabilization unfeasible. The country ended 1988 with an inflation rate of 1,722%. To put the figure in context, in 2025, Peru recorded around 1.5%, and in 2024 about 1.9% inflation. And even so, the everyday feeling is that everything goes up. Can you imagine what it means to live with an inflation rate of more than 1,700%? The middle class ceased to exist. More than half of the population began to live below the poverty line. Peru entered a social depression. The collective mood left protests behind and was replaced by something much sadder, a deep hopelessness. Money was just a worthless piece of paper. The country became a financial pariah internationally. Being poor stopped being an exception and became part of normal life. And as if that weren't enough, terrorist violence completely engulfed the city, adding fear to the uncertainty. Peru became an inhospitable place, a real nightmare, a horror movie with different monsters capable of controlling everything. So many made the inevitable decision to flee. In just a few years, more than 250,000 Peruvians left their homes in search of a different future in the United States, Argentina, Venezuela, Spain, Japan. Any destination seemed better than what awaited them if they decided to stay. It's no coincidence that all of us have at least one relative or acquaintance who went to live in another country during those terrible years in Peru's history. By the final stretch of the Garcia era, the state was completely bankrupt. Inflation was so high that the real value of taxes disappeared between the moment the tax obligation arose and the time it was collected. At the end of 1989, the annual inflation rate ended at a record high of 2,775% inflation, more than 1,000 percentage points higher than the previous year. It was the definitive confirmation that the country had lost control of its own economy. The decline in living standards pushed millions of Peruvians across the threshold into food insecurity. Families had to cut back on their diets to alarming levels. Meat became an unattainable luxury item for the majority. Even chicken, a staple on ordinary people's tables, became too expensive. The price per kilo had gone from 13 intis to 170,000. The crisis was no longer just an economic figure. It was hunger coming through the door of every home. And in the markets, the so-called red bones started to become popular. Bones that still had small bits of meat or cartilage on them. People would line up since dawn to get them. And when that wasn't possible, they had to settle for white bones, which at least added some fat and calcium to the broths. The consumption of offal skyrocketed. Lung, heart, intestines, everything that used to be considered scraps became a lifesaver. Just like the popular bread, a small yellowish and hard bread made with mixtures of low-quality flour. Sugar also disappeared from millions of tables and was replaced by raw cane sugar. Many even sweetened their drinks with cheap candies. Those were times when you didn't choose what to eat. You simply made do with whatever was still left in the market, if you were lucky. But perhaps one of the harshest symbols of that desperation was the consumption of Nicovita, a brand of balanced animal feed. Small compacted pellets rich in proteins, vitamins, and minerals. It wasn't fit for human consumption, but it became a last resort for people driven into a corner by hunger. This was the sad portrait of Peru under Alan Garcia, a country paralyzed by fear, uncertainty, and malnutrition. A country that had hit rock bottom. Alan left the government palace in July 1990, leaving behind an approval rating of less than 6% and a nation that was unrecognizable, exhausted, and morally defeated. During his last official speech before Congress, he was booed and not allowed to speak. That scene brutally summed up the collapse of a project that once inspired hope. That young prodigy, who just 5 years earlier had presented himself as the symbol of change through hypnotic rhetoric and overwhelming confidence, was leaving the chamber having failed to deliver on everything he promised. He had promised to break the chains, but only made the chains heavier. He had promised not to kneel before the International Monetary Fund, but ended up bringing the whole country to its knees before misery and despair. He promised social justice and left millions fighting for bones in the markets. But perhaps the most puzzling thing, the part of this story that I find hardest to understand, is that only 16 years later, that same man would be re-elected president by the same people he had left in ruins. Peru has a strange relationship with memory and power, a dangerous tendency to turn the past into a bearable anecdote, to forget and repeat. That's why I decided to tell this story.
Nationalization does not mean state ownership. Nationalization means that we have the right to make our government Peruvian. We are against imperialism, Yanks. We are against all imperialism, against the imperialism that demands payment of debts from us, that imposed them on us in the first place.
He will only allocate $1 out of every $10 to the debt. The International Monetary Fund would have to organize the entire country's economy to pay the foreign debt. We do not pay the foreign debt.
We are going through a temporary shortage of some products, but I want to emphasize to the public that this is a temporary situation and that we should not lose our composure in the face of an economic setback, which is a relapse of the serious illness the country is suffering from. Our aim is to nationalize the banks.
And in that there is no turning back. That is why, at this moment, I propose to Congress its nationalization and state ownership.
And I ask, what are the Velasquista ideologues doing in the government palace deciding the future of freedom in Peru?
The devaluation of the Peruvian currency has reached such a point that the highest denomination bill, the 5,000 intis, is worth barely $3. On this small street in downtown Lima, coins are sold by the kilo because they are no longer accepted in commercial transactions and are used for making handicrafts. On cash registers and calculators, the number of zeros causes problems in accounting.
The hotel reports that they have run out of rice and sugar.
No, miss, we couldn't find any sugar or rice because of the earthquake. Can you see how things are in the pile? What should we do now, colleague? We have to look for it. We have to pay above the price. We have to pay more than the official price for rice.
It's a robbery, what
they're doing here.
Here in the People's Cape. How can this be possible?
Look, and also note 200.
What an ugly black guy. Look, there's no control over anything here.
I've come to deposit money to withdraw.
To withdraw, basically. Because there's uncertainty.
In 1985, you could buy with a certain amount a big stack of bills. You could buy a pickup truck, a new car, with that same money. I'm not exaggerating. With that same money. 5 years later, when Alan's term ended, instead of buying a car, do you know what you could buy? With the same money, half a pack of cigarettes.
Desperate after waiting in line since 5 a.m. without service, these mothers broke down the doors of the state-run supermarket.
We have found ourselves having to do this. We admit looting was wrong, but people are in need.
No, it can't be. That can't be. Also, it's fine to charge something every 2 or 4 or 8 or 6 years, but not every month.
How did you find the market in this condition?
Everything's empty and nothing's there. The prices are so high now, money isn't enough for anything.
We can't take it anymore. The country's economic situation is killing us.
If you like this story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and browse the channel for others you might also enjoy. See you in the next one. Goodbye.